Okay, welcome everybody to our final session of the day. I'm Andrew Butler. I've been behind the scenes tweeting and trying to admit latecomers to the room at a convenient point in the proceedings. So I'm very pleased to be joined by a treasured colleague, Dr. Paul March Russell, who is the editor of Foundation, science fiction journal that is one of the best top 3 science fiction academic journals in the world, and is also commissioning editor for SF Story Worlds, a non-fiction imprint that comes out of Canterbury. So this afternoon, for his first task, he will be interviewing Dominic Power, who adapted Ridley Walker for Radio 4 broadcast.
Right.
Our moderator has gone.
Yes.
Reconnecting. That's good. Bit of one glitch today.
Okay, I'm back. Okay, so can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I was midway through saying Paul is interviewing Dominic Power, who adapted Ridley Walker for Radio 4 broadcast at the end of 1996. I'm sure there's lots more that Paul will draw out than just that. So over to you, Paul.
Fantastic. Yes, I'm absolutely delighted to have Dominic Power here with us. She doesn't have that. Dominic was also head of screen arts at the National Film and Television School and co-editor of the journal The New Soundtrack. And as Andrew was saying, he adapted Ridley Walker in the mid-1990s, broadcast first on Radio 4, then a longer version on Radio 3. Dominic, it's great to have you. So first question I asked was, how and when did you first encounter Ridley Walker?
It's hard to remember, actually, but I read it fairly soon after it was published. We sort of knew Russell vaguely through friends. And then my wife started a magazine called The Fiction Magazine, which Russell actually was contributed to and was great. And I read it, my wife read it first. She was a huge fan and as always just passed it on. And I was completely blown away by it. And I remember the first reading taking time to digest. It's a book with aftershocks. And you keep realizing how far down it goes. So that was my first introduction to it, and I think I was I was rather shy of actually talking to Russell about it. I don't know why. The times I met him after that, but it had a very big influence on me, and I remember thinking at the time how strange that the great British novel, which I think it is written by an American who normal business would be writing the great American novel. What British novel for me.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about how you felt so reticent about sort of approaching Russell about what the book meant to you. So, what was it that impressed you most about the novel? What was that really hooked you, as it were?
Well, as I said, it comes in aftershocks. I think initially the language just blew me away. And it's an odd thing of it being familiar to me in a way that I couldn't quite understand. And then I realized it was because it was a picaresque novel. And the kind of Cervantes thing or Henry Fielding thing of stories within stories, all that I found incredibly welcoming. But then just puzzling about the implications of what it was. I'm interested that it has such a reputation as a science fiction novel, which I think it's was science fiction novel of the year or whatever. But because it seems to go in this strange loop. It's forward in time, we know, but it's back in time.
Yeah.
And and you know, the kind of strange societal creation myth that it has. And I'm still, you know, I'm still getting meanings out of it. It's I mean, it is an extraordinarily great book, and rather spoilt me for other books for a while.
Really?
Well, for the modern novel, it did, yes, certainly, because I mean, it's the kind of flavour of that is very hard to achieve in any. I mean, there are some that have come close. I mean, I say the Kahalanami might be one that kind of approached that in a sort of somewhat different way. But I'm not normally a fan of what are called dystopian novels. I mean, yes, fine, but this seemed to go so far beyond that.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you, and I think the comparison to Sarah Hall's novel is really interesting, actually. What point did you think that you wanted to adapt the novel to radio? What, you know?
Well, here's the thing. I hadn't thought of adapting it for radio at all. And in fact, I was a slightly strange thing in the mid-90s. I mean, I'd stopped writing radio for a while. I mean, I'd written radio first when I was at university, and then I stopped and did other things. And one day in 1994, I got a letter from the producer saying, my friend Michael Fox, who was radio producer then, and he said, Russell Hoban has suggested you for adapting Ridley Walker. He was going to do it, but the time thing in it hadn't been okayed. So we're going to have to go through the whole process again, but he suggested you would be the person to do it. And I was profoundly surprised. And I just thought, oh, yes, please.
Were you intimidated at all? Were you like, gosh, how do I do this? You know?
I was intimidated on a level of if I got it wrong for Russell, I would have felt awful. But you think, I mean, I love radio as a form, and I just think it's so full of possibilities. You just think, and you know, there are still things I wish I could have done that. I wish I could have done an adaptation of Huckleberry Finn, or whatever. And you just think, no, this is going to be great. And yes, of course, you realise there are problems. You know, there are going to be difficulties. But no, it just seemed full of possibility. It took us, you know, it was a year from then for actually getting it okayed by the BBC, which involved various treatments and things. And I just all the time thinking, I just want to get down and write it, you know.
That's interesting. I want to ask about the other adaptations in a second, but did you feel there was any kind of resistance on the part of the BBC to this? Because it is also kind of rather sort of left field novel in some respects. So I don't know.
I felt no. I mean, I don't. I mean, Michael would have known better than me. I remember we were, you know, when I first met Michael, we were just taken in, said hi, and this is going to be great. And then, of course, you know, then there is a process that it actually has to be resubmitted and what have you. And that was all a bit white knuckling. I didn't feel as if there was resistance to it. Michael, who'd seen it in Manchester, I mean, was terribly dedicated to the you know, to getting it done. He was a huge fan, and I think had a phenomenal understanding of it as well. I think he and I probably had rather the same reaction to it.
Sorry.
No, that's
You mentioned that Michael seeing it in Manchester, and of course, Russell Hoban had adapted Willy Walker to the stage. So, were you influenced at all by what he had done, or did you try to take your own individual response to the text?
I hadn't seen the stage version.
Mm.
My wife did actually, but I hadn't. Because I hadn't been able to get away from work, I think was probably the reason. And no, I mean, I really just wanted the book,
Mm.
and that was all. I didn't, in any adaptation I've done, I've kept a million miles from. I mean, some years later, I did The History Man and had to
Yeah.
go through progressive therapy to remove any memory of Christopher Hampton's television version
Yes.
from my mind. It's just because, so yeah, no, I mean, it was just the book really that I lived with,
Mm.
and I have to say, adapting something is a great way to read a book or reread a book,
Mm.
because you're in a dialogue with it as well, which
Mm.
is wonderful. So
There's a kind of critical engagement as well in adapting, I suppose.
yes, and an imaginative engagement.
Mm.
I remember, because it was obviously very clear that you have to use the language.
Mm.
That's an absolute, and that never seemed to be a problem.
Mm.
But I remember the delight when I suddenly realised I was able to speak the language,
Yeah.
and I was able to riff on the language, and I thought,
Mm.
oh, that's wonderful, and it's actually it's linguistically that strong, you can
Yeah.
do.
On that point, I mean, actually, just thinking about it, Russell Hoban said that after he wrote the novel, his own sort of sense of grammar became distorted. Did Ridley speak have a similar effect upon you? Did you sort of, once you imbibe the language and try and adapt it, did it
we had
affect
to make a kind of limit ourselves talking it in our house. I know that
yours?
while I was doing it. Um, uh, I remember when I was doing it, I got most of the way through, and I very cleverly turned off spell check, and then by accident, I think I must have turned it on. And it was this kind of nightmare underline. And actually, I remember feeling kind of curiously vertiginous and slightly sick when I saw it.
Yeah,
Because you realize how far we departed in a way. But
yeah, of course.
it is a very addictive language, I think. But it's
Yeah.
so witty and elusive and right and expressive, and it's
Mm.
terribly expressive.
What were the biggest challenges in adapting the novel?
Um, it's not that I'm saying that I found it easy, but I think if you trust the book,
Mm.
I did. I found it one of the happiest. I mean, I've done a few adaptations. I found that one of the happiest I've done,
Oh wow.
because I did trust the book, and the book
Mm.
just takes you there.
Mm.
It's a very good companion,
Mm.
and so I didn't find. I mean, yes, doing the physical side of that, which is basic radio stuff,
Mm.
when people go in water, or
Mm.
when you are, when you're in certain types of acoustic spaces, then there's, I mean, I'm getting the action done, but that that's a technical thing, which is not. But I think actually, um, my biggest challenge was getting it in on time, getting it in 2 hours, and
Mm.
in which I failed. And
Mm.
when we got the sort of final cut, when Michael said, "With editing, I don't know what's going to happen," and then it went out with a section which could be taken out missing, and that, gosh, how painful. And
Mm.
then it came, it was put back for Radio 3.
Mm.
So yeah, it was very hard to get it in
Mm.
the right in 120 minutes.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
that's what I was thinking. Because, as you said at the start, there's so much in the novel that to know how to compress that or condense it, that I think must have been a challenge.
yes, I mean, I was the picaresque side of it, the story within the story
Mm.
side is so important, and um, they tell a lot of what is necessary to the story. So it was always essential to keep those in. Um, uh, I think, I mean, there are so many flourishes in the book. I
Mm.
mean, character flourishes. Some of those go because of time,
Mm.
and I, you know, I can't remember some of the ones that had to go, but yes, things
Mm.
had to go. I never really felt. I mean, I did feel all the time the book was taking me along with it. So a strange sense of it gives you an enormous confidence that this
Mm.
is, and when you, I mean, adapting anything, you think I've got to make changes.
Mm.
I shortly after this, I adapted Joseph Andrews, and I realised that Henry Fielding, in a dramatic sense, never finished jokes, and
Yeah.
you had to kind of write the dramatic punchlines, as it
Mm.
were.
Mm. Mm.
And it was very pleasant, but you had to do that.
Mm.
So you were aware of that. But actually, in Ridley, no, it was
Mm.
you just felt you trusted it every day,
Yeah.
and it would take you along.
Fantastic, yeah. Again, I was listening to the performance yesterday afternoon, the Radio 3 version, and being very impressed by it, I have to say. It was, even though it's a, it's an audio medium, it was so very visual. I could really see what was actually happening in the story. I was wondering, to what extent was that influenced by the language? Did the language actually help you in adapting the book to a radio form?
I think so, yes, because I mean, the language as a form of storytelling
Mm.
is so good, and it's going to pull people in, you know.
Mm.
I got very fastidious about spelling it exactly right in the language terms, because it reads fine when you do it.
Mm.
Yes, I think that was very good. It just also it created um, this fragmented world, this world that has run
Mm.
down, and I think that's helped by the language. It's expressive of of distress in a way.
Mm.
Just mean being miserable. I mean things being distressed, um, and I think that's uh, yes, I think that's a very powerful part of the
Mm.
language.
Mm. And the other aspect which really came through was the storytelling. It's a key part of the novel, and I'm also a kind of short story expert as well, and short stories work fantastically well, I think, on the radio. So do you think that the radio medium, like the novel, just sort of perfect for the oral tradition? Did you think it wasn't just story, it was a quality of it? Did you feel that was a really key component you wanted to bring out in the adaptation?
Yes, I mean on some uh, rather loose level, it is a kind of gather around the fire
Mm.
narrative. Um, uh, um, and yes, I mean, absolutely. And I think that, again, comes within the stories. People are
Mm.
telling stories all the time. So there are kind of little fragmentary short stories within it.
Mm.
Um, uh, um, and, you know, a journey works well on the radio,
Yeah.
um, you know. And I kind of think, in a way, it always seemed very natural that the pictures would be for people in people's minds.
Mm.
It's going, you know, because this is new. mean, the language is new, the way of absorbing it. I think you'll get the hang of it very quickly, but it's surprising. You know, you're not getting anything like a radio drama,
Yeah.
as was known. You know, and I think that that was it. I found myself thinking about the Beckett radio dramas, which also have that sense of language being slightly distressed. It's
Yeah,
also,
like all that falls and things like that.
yeah. And I've always seen those as a kind of gold standard of radio. It's also very musical, I think, and I found myself. You find yourself compositionally shaping it. So
Yeah.
where it foreshadows, where themes will come back in, it seemed to me to be musical, and that helped. I mean, that was another thing. It helped shape it. And
Yeah, definitely. There's that. I mean, I think there's passages when the rhymes are actually given presented as songs or as incantations, and there's also kind of counterpointed in the narrative as well, which I think presentation really brings out really well. I was also thinking that also the kind of the oral and the visual, it's very atmospheric, and I wonder how you and the production team went about constructing the atmosphere of that far future post-apocalyptic England. How did you bring that atmosphere out?
well, it was initially was a plan to be. I think Michael wanted to do a location, which would have been wonderful, and I think any future thing maybe should do that. We were in the studio in Manchester, and we had a brilliant sound person. I seem to remember a very happy time walking on a squelch mat, which they let me do for me. Keep me out of the way.
Adapter's perk.
It was an adapter's perk, and I think there was, you know, a lot of it gets done. You hear it's done afterwards in a way, but the sound effects and everything were wonderful. Yeah, the atmospherics are terribly good, and that's a good director. But it didn't hit me how well it had been done in terms of atmospheres and sounds until I actually heard it. Then I was knocked out because you're hearing the recording and you're.
Yeah, I found it incredibly immersive to listen to, and I think that was something to do there with the language and the narrative, and I think you were extremely fortunate in the cast that you had, which was I thought an excellent cast as well.
Yes, I mean it was a wonderful cast, I think. The only thing is we were drawing in a lot of cases from the north of England, so they aren't the accents are. I mean, I don't think we have Kent accents.
No, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting because actually this is something that I was mentioning to Paul Kincaid, who's one of the contributors on the YouTube channel, and my late great colleague Dave Reason. He used to read from the novel in classes, but give it a West Country accent. And which actually worked really well. So it's really interesting. It's really interesting. It's meant to be Kent, but it has this sort of again. If you get into the kind of the rhythm of a local dialect, it really works really well.
Yes. Well, I think with the North, it worked very well. But then again, I think the actors, there were other, people like Joe Emilio, obviously London. It's playing the rhythm really.
Yeah.
And everyone got that. I think it's
Yeah.
no one, I think, was at all intimidated.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's really interesting.
I mean, I
Um,
could just say, let me at it, because
yeah,
it's a big challenge, really.
yeah, that's true. I can well imagine that. Yeah, definitely. You mentioned now that initially was an idea that maybe you're doing on location, which you couldn't do. So, if you had an opportunity to do this again, would you do anything differently now, or would you include some other aspect of the novel, or are you happy just as it is?
I would, I would love. I mean, if I did it again, we did offer it again actually,
Mhm.
um, in a few years back, um, uh, to do maybe a serial version. It
Mm,
wasn't picked up, but I would love to do it again. But I think I would close the book on uh,
mm,
what I'd done
mm,
previously
mm.
and just start again,
Yeah,
and see how it goes. Because it is, I think you might find something very different. Again,
yeah.
it's a book with so many layers that
Mm,
um, you might find yourself going down another path.
yeah. I mean, looking at some of the artists we've had today, which are much sort of in the shadow of climate change or colonialism. I mean, these are aspects that might we might think about more about today now, I suppose,
Yeah.
in new adaptation. Um, Coming towards the end of the interview, it's been again fantastic to speak with you. I wanted to think though, as you mentioned right at the start, you already knew Russell Hoban when the novel was published, so you had a very long friendship with him. So, what was he like to work with, and how do you most remember him?
I remember him kind of best over lunch, because our friendship was formed on lunches conducted in an Italian restaurant run by Spaniards, and it was and I remember reading his work. He would bring it in, and we would eat, and I would read, and we would talk about it, and it was because the later works are London works,
Mm,
um, and it's a whole. I admire them so much
mm,
because it's a kind of another kind of vertigo way of seeing London. It's
mm,
it's the beach beneath the pavement. I mean, it's
mm,
London full of it's a slightly occult London full of
yeah.
surprises, and also just day-to-day stuff that
Mm,
I recognized. Um, I remember going. We would always just go and buy videos and later DVDs after lunch. We'd swap them and talk about. Um, uh, I have to say that Russell was extraordinarily the most generous man.
mm,
A man who didn't suffer fools, but he was really generous.
mm,
He was extraordinarily helpful to me.
mm,
If I'd written something he didn't like, he would sort of say, "Oh, no, that doesn't really work for me." Yeah, he was great. Um,
mm,
uh, I remember when my wife got ill, she mentioned that she liked Patrick O'Brian, and he just
mm.
had biked round a whole set of Patrick O'Brian novels for her,
Wow.
which we still have.
Oh,
And I think
fantastic.
he was miss him a lot.
Mm,
Um, uh, he was a great person too,
mm,
and he didn't. I've never known Russell to have an unoriginal thought.
mm, mm,
Um, and he loved England.
mm,
Um, it was an American looking at it, like as I said, he's the American who wrote the great British novel.
mm.
And
In the last bit we're here celebrating Willy Walker, but you mentioned those later novels. Is there a late novel that you'd recommend people to read as well?
um, Amaryllis Night and
Mm,
Day is wonderful.
mm,
Um, I look at the novels from Angelica's Grotto as a kind of evolving pattern of
mm.
of characters coming in. I actually appear as a character in some of them,
Immortalised.
which is under the name Seamus Flannery, which I thought
Mm,
pleasant and odd. um, uh, but Amaryllis Night and Day is fantastic. It's part of it's to do with Klein bottles,
Mm.
and I just think that, I mean, Russell just became obsessed with that. And it was a very good way of describing that slightly odd looping feeling.
Yeah.
You might get in Ridley Walker, or you might get walking through London under the influence of Russell Hoban's London.
Mm.
I mean, it's not someone he necessarily would have. I thought of Arthur Mackin a bit about the London novels, because they are Walker's and London's London novels.
Absolutely.
And they have a bit of the occult, although I'm not sure how keen Russell was on. Loved H.P. Lovecraft, but I don't. The kind of London adventure novels. Yeah, I think I'd give a big shout out for those, because I don't think they have been acknowledged enough as really extraordinary pieces of work.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dominic. Thank you. Sonia, I think if you want to bring us our final session, the book club session, that would be fantastic. Or do we have any questions? We do that.
So I can feed questions in, or we can move into the discussion. Okay. Feral Practice asks, is the radio play available online?
Not as far as I know. I mean, except it's available in my hard drive. Radio plays have I don't think have a long enough shelf life, really. Oddly, I mean, you know, sometimes they used to be put out on CDs. I don't think this one was. I'm happy to send it to anyone who would like to hear it.
Thank you. Any further questions? That's made Fiona very happy, so we'll make sure you're in touch for surreptitious self-piracy of radio plays.
I think I'm allowed to self-pirate. I hope I am. But,
it's no fun if you can't, is it?
I had to ring Team Know-How to tell me how to send the large document to Paul, so I can now do it, and I'm very pleased.
Okay, so that seems to be getting some positive likes. So
excellent.
Have we got any more questions to Dominic? Okay, well, shall we bring in Peter Vujakovic, who is Emeritus Professor of Geography. Obviously, thank you to Dominic and Paul for the interview so far, but we'll bring in Peter if he's there, and Sonia, so we can conclude the events of this afternoon or the day with a more general discussion of the novel. So, hello, Sonia. Have we got Peter there? Peter.
Yeah, I think I probably came across some of his Russell Hoban's other novels first, like Bulgaman and others. But I think the critical thing about the novel is the fact that I've lived, certainly for the last 13 years, about 13, 14 years, right in the middle of sort of Ridley World. But going back even further, my father, who was a refugee, worked literally a mile away from Widder's Dump. As an undergraduate, I worked on the Mr. Clever's place as a biogeographer, because I've been immersed in that landscape for a long time. And because it is such an immersive, you just so much part of it. And as a geographer, place names and the map, all that really sort of just chimes so much with that sort of real sort of immersive interest in lands. And I think it's the way it sort of links in with other interests. So I'm interested in place and change over time, as I say in that short video. And the idea of mapper's biography. So I'm very interested in that idea, the mapper's biography, autobiography, biography of landscape. And I think his map, in the is something very important for me. So I suppose it's really that idea that it, takes you, immerses you in that landscape, however cold, dark, and wet it is much of the time.
So Paul, what led you to the novel?
Well, the Mason novel, it was initially Dominic's adaptation. Actually, I knew the name of Ridley Walker, but was somehow kind of intimidated by it, and sort of had a kind of cult aura about it, and I wasn't quite sure how to approach it. And it was actually Dominic's adaptation that sort of led me into the novel, and then going on to teach the novel at university as well. So that was my sort of lead into it, and again, I think it's just what Peter was just mentioning, that sense of immersion, of just great depth and profundity to the writing. And I think this was also probably tying in with a lot of stuff that I was working at the time around. I know Sonia works with psychogeography, and I was doing some stuff there. Infrequent conversations with Ian Sinclair. So it kind of sort of fitted in there with me, with that sense of sort of walking through the landscape and reimagining the landscape and thinking through history and memory and all those kinds of traces. So that these are things that really hooked me about the novel, and still do. So.
And Sonia, how did you come to the novel?
I came across the novel because so many people were telling me I really ought to be reading it. A friend who's a performance storyteller, Ben Haggerty, said, "You perform with puppets, you're interested in fictional landscapes, you live in Kent, and you haven't read Ridley Walker, shame on you." So obviously I did, and huge thanks to him for steering me towards it. As Paul was saying, my interest is very much in our relationship to landscape and how landscape makes us feel and how it makes us behave. And Ridley Walker is soaked in the landscape. I mean, literally soaked, completely admired in the landscape, which is very exciting. And as Peter was saying, we can walk that landscape, we can see that landscape, we can move through it, we can imagine ourselves into it, and that's very powerful for any piece of fiction. And
you had a project 2 years ago now, which was pairing it with Anglo-Saxon document narrative.
Yes, that's right. I worked with my colleague Maya Bentley, who's an Anglo-Saxon translator, and we produced a kind of a project that mapped his translation of Andreas, the myth of Andreas, onto landscape and Ridley Walker as well, and we were looking at synergies between these texts and how there are moments of magic and place in them, and of ruination and savagery and all of these things that seem to connect them very much with Canterbury in mind.
Rob Maslin has said that he would love to think of the novel as a piece as a Jewish novel. So can any of you speak to it in terms of how we would regard it in terms of the tradition of Jewish novel? This is to put all four of you on the spot immediately.
I've been hesitating on that at the moment. I wouldn't or even try to get down that route myself, but it was interesting what was said about him being an American and sort of understanding and getting England. And people of the Presburg Hell film, The Canterbury Tale, and I made a comment saying it was much foreign background. He was not alien, he was an alien, so banned from food. He brought this.
Cutting in and out.
Peter, you're breaking up.
Essentially, it's not really answering. It's answering this idea of outsider. The issue of outsiders sort of understanding this landscape in a different way, perhaps to people like Powell, who was immersed in it from a very early age.
Right, okay, I think we lost a lot of that there, but I think I heard Peter making a connection with Michael Powell and Pressburger's A Canterbury Tale, and pointing out that Pressburger was a quote-unquote alien, so he wasn't actually allowed to film in Kent, presumably under his working conditions.
Yeah.
So I think the point being made there was, in terms of, it is an outsider's view of England, but enables you to get under the skin of it that bit much more.
I would say, just to go back to Ridley Walker as a novel in the Jewish tradition, I mean, it just was obviously just an important part of Russell. I don't know how, and I think he would always draw on maybe those kind of storytelling traditions. His father was the editor of the Jewish Daily Forward, I think, which was, was actually a Yiddish paper. I've never really heard him talk consciously about that, but I think it obviously informed everything he did. But again, it's because he's so submerged in that world. It's not, I think, in any surface way that.
Yeah, I mean, I read an interview with Russell Hoban in about mid-80s, so a few years after Ridley Walker, and he says that he was a very religious man, but that he didn't want to see any of his novels as being sort of allegories of any particular faith, or he might take something from Judaism or something from Christianity or something from Buddhism or whatever it might be, and kind of bring them together. So I don't think he ever wanted to be read as a straightforwardly allegorical writer in that sense. But I suspect there are kind of traces in that. I think certainly the Yiddishness and the storytelling, I think that came through again to me when I was listening to the radio play the other day. Actually, I was actually suddenly thought about that actually. As I don't think he was like specifically drawing upon any one religious faith.
He was very interested in all sorts of religion. I remember him questioning me very much about Catholicism, which is where I come from, and he was wanted to incorporate some of that into a novel, and he just was interested. And I think the whole iconography of St. Eustace and things, I mean, he obviously inhabited that very much.
Somebody said, has one of you mentioned a television adaptation? Is anybody
No.
aware of any attempts have done so?
No, I don't believe there has been. Russell had various, I know there were various thoughts of making a film of it, but it didn't happen. I think it was Lawrence Jackson who was saying, it's a film that needs to be made. I can't understand why, because again, it's something that seems to film itself. I just think it would be a fantastic film. But no one, I think there were various meetings about it, I think with George Miller maybe at one time. But nothing came of it. I don't know why.
I read somewhere that Werner Herzog was approached and absolutely flatly refused and said that this book must never be made into a film because it is a cinematic book and they mustn't impose upon it. So it would be interesting to see if anyone else will rise to the challenge.
I'd love to get the reference to that. I hadn't heard that. That's really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, he would be the perfect filmmaker for it, of course.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
And and on the George Miller connection, it's certainly been suggested that Miller used some elements from Ridley Walker.
I lost your voice.
But
Paul, we lost you for a second.
well, you mentioned George Miller. George Miller directed the Mad Max movies, and some people suggest that some of them, the elements from Willy Walker entered into the Mad Max movies as well. Quite sure how or where, but nevertheless, that's what's been suggested.
It's quite definitely there. I think. I think lots of people noticed that, including Russell. I have to say, yeah. Weirdly, I always felt there's a very bad Kevin Costner movie called The Postman, which is another poster, and it has the traveling show. It has elements of that in. Not a good movie though, unfortunately.
I mean, but something that was being filmed just before lockdown was Station 11, which is a post-pandemic narrative based on a novel by Emily St. John Mandel is the name, I think.
Yeah.
And that again, it's got travelling actors rather than puppeteers, but it seems to be culture has to survive after the end of the world some way, and travelling actors seem to be it. So I'm suddenly flashing back to my edition of Catch-22. It's got an introduction by Anthony Burgess talking about the impossibility of adapting books to film, particularly where language is important. So I would imagine this was a introduction written shortly after A Clockwork Orange. So it might be that language and pictures working a book and on radio, but maybe not on the big screen.
Burgess put it in his 99 great novels, and Burgess, of course, himself wrote an imaginary language for the screen. I can't remember what the film was now.
Quest for Fire, something like
that. Well, yes,
that's right.
It.
Yeah. It was Neanderthals or something like that. I'm not sure I've ever seen it, but it's But Burgess might have been your man to do the screenplay, I suppose.
Yes, he might well have been. Russell was a huge film fan and consumed a huge amount of film. I think he would have loved a film to have been made of it.
Okay, we've got another question from Feral Practice Fiona MacDonald for you again, Dominic. To me, the magic of the language is partly in the disjunction between the visual and the sonic experience of it, rhythmically speak / spelling. How do you tackle that on the radio?
Yes, I mean, there is no way to actually, because when you read it on the page, it's wonderful. The only thing I said I felt very strongly was that you wrote it. You spelt it exactly right in Ridley Speak, and the language, the actors will find that tone, but there's no way to, I think, make the visual aware there. I agree, it's beautiful on the page.
Somebody asked, do we feel that this novel's got any lessons for our current political climate? We've thought in terms of pandemic and Anthropocene and the end of the world, but it's also a novel about leadership, isn't it? So have we got any kind of life lessons for leadership lessons for our great overlords from the novel?
I think Sam Jordasen's response tackled this rather bluntly, I thought, and rather wonderfully when he was talking about living in a time of sense making against misinformation, and as he put it, having charlatans in charge. And I think that's a very interesting parallel. Perhaps this should be compulsory reading.
I think his time has just come round again. He's also fantastically good at the wickedness of the political voice. Good parley, and there's something rendering that which you recognise in that language. uh, it's great. But yes, I mean, I think it's more relevant now, perhaps than it was. I don't know, but maybe we just are closer to the edge now.
I think I'll go back to one of the quotations that Charlotte was using in her piece this morning, and I think, but if you don't think the thought for yourself, then somebody else will think it for you, and that notion of control and of agency, I think that's one of the things that really makes it pertinent to where we are now, and that sense of having to speak back to fake news or speak back to different kinds of propaganda or social media memes, and actually kind of reclaiming that space, private, individual, skeptical thought, I think is really important. That's I think is one of the lessons that Ridley learns in the course of the narrative.
I remember thinking when I first read it, the link between that and Huckleberry Finn it seemed to be it's another great book, and the ideas in it, I think, because Russell maybe let himself be very free in that it's taking on ideas that are going to resonate at different times. And I remember saying it when I first read it, it was like a series of aftershocks. And I think we maybe are just still getting the aftershocks.
Yeah. I think the question is, do we know what these locations might actually be? Do they have a real world equivalent? I don't know.
Yeah, there is a website that is quite train spottery one that tries to identify every place. Stick It Flats comes up as Sticking Flats, but I'd have to look at the OS map for that. I think they're two of the less important sites. The others I think are probably more important in terms of the way the name has been developed in association with the history of things. So Dunk Your Arse. The fact that Dungeness is now drowned out at sea has more interest. I think those two are a bit obscure. I think the others are much more interesting. I mean, the one that gets me is the fact that everyone thinks that how is why. And it's the one that's least near its supposed place when you map it. So that's getting a bit train spottery as well. But I don't think we should I think the names, are more interesting in the sense that they become meaningful names to Ridley. They say something about the place, Widder's Dump. Whereas, we live in these places, I say in that short video, where place names just become sounds. You have to go back a long way to find out what their original meaning is. So I think what he's doing there is helping us to go, we need to get back and get to grips with what names really mean. And his character's the same. I mean, they, Mr. Clunchman or whichever one it is, I'm getting that wrong, I think. These names mean something. They're the head. So names become more meaningful even if they're played in Ridley.
We've got somebody has offered us a link to errorbar.net/rw/places, errorbar.net /rw/places. I think there's probably a link to it from somewhere on the event blog, but that's the one where they've rather cleverly, nerdishly, fastidiously gone through and explained all the jokes, as it were. So that will have, that's the best place to look, I would argue. Sylvia Curtis says, I've been wondering what to make of the collapsing of politics and science into religion in England. When here out in our Enlightenment era time, way back, they treat themselves as three pretty separate things. So any kind of comment upon collapsing of politics, science and religion into one thing within the novel, as opposed to distinct situations where we never follow the science, perhaps?
Yes, well, perhaps we are experiencing a slightly sort of pre-enlightenment moment in that, yeah, things have become less rational than perhaps they should be at the moment. I think there's something to be said about this kind of re-guessing that we're doing at the moment, that we're not perhaps separating things as well as we should. I don't know if that's what Silvio's getting at. I think it's interesting that these things are part of one pot, one way of thinking.
I think it's a tricky one. I don't think. I think we'll be careful here because we're not talking about organised religion in Ridley Walker. The Archbishop of Canterbury is not the Archbishop of Canterbury, you know, as we think of that figure. So it's a kind of collapsing of politics and science into another sense of cosmology, into a faith-based system, but it's not specifically religious in any kind of organised sense. I don't think it's much more folk, sort of kind of folk religion, as it were. In that sense, you know, there might be resonances there with, as somebody just said, but kind of sort of irrationalism behind kind of QAnon conspiracy theorists and things like that. But again, I don't know. I think it comes back to notions of kind of creation myths and kind of cosmologies that you'd find in, you know, in much older societies. And I don't think it's quite the same as we've got at the moment. I don't think.
Yes, I agree with that. Is a kind of debased cosmology that's been worked out, I think, in the book.
I mean, I'm not entirely sure how far these things have ever quite been separated out. And I think if you go to the time of kind of Turner and the kind of scientists of the early 19th century, I think there's a great debate between those who are religious, those who are scientists, and those who are artists and the rest of it. And it's partly to do with who gets to be the chattering classes, I guess, as much as anything. Barbara Becker observed, politics and religion are grand theatre. Punch and Judy is a great model that is applicable to both. Certainly when we go to Prime Minister's question times over the years, we kind of think of the Punch and Judy of politics in that. It occurs to me, someone talked earlier about the absence of the dog from the Punch and Judy show. I'm trying to remember, do we get much of Judy in the novel? It seems to be all focused on Mr. Punch.
Well,
There is.
go on.
Sorry. I think there is a Judy figure, isn't there, in the final show that Ridley's on. I thought.
Punch needs his victims, doesn't he? And he needs to put things into the machine, including Judy, pig-like Judy.
And he'll always kill the babby if he can.
Why would he always eat the babby?
Okay, so I think we're coming towards a closing point. I guess everybody here in this virtual room and out there in internet land will have read the novel, but if we're trying to thrust it upon somebody else to read, what strategies would we recommend people who are reading the novel for the first time? So how can we evangelize taking that religious theme for this novel? So what's the best tactic to understand what's going on in this book? Say?
Read it out loud.
Yep.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Around the fire and read it to each other.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, my standard line when teaching the book was to say, read out loud and annoy your flatmates with it. But I think actually that is an important thing. I think it is like, it's like Shakespeare. It's like, you know, you've got to get into the rhythm of the language. It's the rhythm that produces the meaning, I think. I think that's the really important thing.
Let yourself be submerged is what I would say. Just go right in with it, and it'll pull you along.
Yeah, I agree with that.
No, I think, as everyone says, they read it out loud, but I noticed Jim heard a comment about the map, staring at the map, and so I would add, I suppose, as a geographer, get a good copy of the OS map for the area, but make it the old first series 1 to 25,000 original series. It's a much more beautiful map.
I would also say take it for a walk. Take the ideas for a walk.
I mean, speaking of OS maps, in the afterword to, I think it's the 2012 edition, Hoban talks about poring over Ordnance Survey maps and being taken out on Cessna airplanes overhead and being rowed out in a boat off Godwin Sands. So we perhaps can't all do that as readers, but certainly the map seems to be a way into it. So, okay, so thank you to our 4 speakers. Wi-Fi does seem to be against us in this final session, so perhaps, Sonia, you'd like to draw things to a close.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Dominic and Paul, for your wonderful interview, and to Peter for joining us as well in that last session. Thank you to everyone who's contributed today. We hugely appreciate it. It's been fantastic. This is not how we imagined this event happening when we first started planning it 3 years ago. I realised when I went back through my emails. We hoped we would all be sitting together in the centre of Canbury. We imagined screenings, we imagined walks, we imagined so much. But let's hope that this is the beginning of something. Huge thanks to all of our presenters, to everybody that's supported it, to the Russell Hoban Estate for allowing us to do this. Also to the University of Kent and Canterbury Christ Church University. We've had a lot of assistance from many people. Thank you to the Arthur C. Clarke Award and the Science Fiction Foundation, to the Canterbury Festival, to Festival Chat. I could sound like I'm receiving an Oscar now, which is not the idea. Thank you for coming. I'm going to share some more in the chat. There are more events on the horizon. I don't know, Paul, if you'd like to speak to what's coming up for you, being human, perhaps.
Yeah. I'll quickly mention. It's on the 15th of November. There is going to be a family workshop day. So up at the Gulbenkian, the University of Kent, and we're going to be doing a workshop where we're going to be devising designs for a sculpture, hopefully to be unveiled on the University of Kent campus sometime next year. So 15th November for all families. Please come along to that.
Also, hopefully coming up at some point, we're being in conversation with the Curzon Canterbury, hoping to show a few films that relate to the novel Ridley Walker, in particular looking at a space maybe to screen Stalker, which strikes me as being a film that has lots of resonances, I suspect entirely coincidentally, with Ridley Walker. Hopefully, Fiona Feral Practice, there'll be opportunities for that film to be shown when things open up a bit more. Keep your eye on the blog to see any dates of these future events. So I think the main thing is to join Sonia for her walk tomorrow. If you can't make the writing competition awards evening tonight, Sonia, do you want to say a bit more about the Distance Drift event?
Yes, by all means. So tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, if you can bear to get out of your slippers, we will be going for a walk with some of the themes from Italy. It's a future archaeology walk, and we're joining forces with Festival Chat 2020, which is an archaeological conference, but kind of festival style rather than buying papers. So just have a look for the hashtag Distance Drift tomorrow on Twitter, and I will be encouraging people to walk as future archaeologists in Ridley's landscape.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so thank you again to all of our speakers, all of you in the chat rooms. Thank you for your patience when the technology is falling over, but this would not be possible without support of a special thanks go to Simon Starr of Canterbury Christchurch University, who has helped us with the technology well beyond the call of duty. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording now, but let's leave the chat open for a few minutes in case anybody wants to contact each other.
Good to meet you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you again, Dominic. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.